Welcome to Business Line's State of the Economy podcast, where you'll find insight, analysis, and the story behind the numbers.
Hey there, welcome to the BL State of the Economy podcast. This is Srivats from Business Line. As part of our year-ender series, we caught up with Dr. K R Srivastava, Chief Policy Advisor at EY India, to gauge the impact of macro and micro policies on the common man in 2024 and also see what holds for him in 2025 in terms of policy improvements. After the second quarter GDP slowdown, Indian economy seems to have hit some rough patch, weighed down by consumption slowdown and government capex having hit a slow lane. In this podcast, Dr. Srivastava reflects on the macro and microeconomic policy shifts of 2024 and their impact on the daily lives of common man. He shares insights on inflation, income growth, and employment trends while outlining key policy expectations for 2025. Welcome to the State of the Economy podcast, Dr. Srivastava.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Great, sir. So the theme of the year-ender on my part would be, how was the year 2024 been for the common man in respect of the both macro and the micro interventions on the policy front? And I would like to speak to you on both counts. And if you permit, I can start with the macro issues to begin with.
Yes, sure.
So, Dr. Srivastava, the main issue agonizing policymakers in recent days is the economic slowdown that was seen in Q2 when we hit a 7-quarter low of 5.4%. Now, how do you see that impinging on the life of a common man, and what is your take on this development?
Well, the Q2 growth at 5.4% with respect to GDP came as a surprise for most observers of the Indian economy. The market expectation was 6.5% RBI. Between RBI and IMF, it was 6.5 to 7%. We are ourselves thought that it would be close to about 6.9% or so, but it was lower by more than 1% points. And the reason why this happened, we can consider in terms of underlying structural reasons as well as some of the proximate or immediate causes. Now, the immediate reason we think is because of the fact that government of India, fell short of its capital expenditure growth target by a massive margin. What was budgeted in terms of infrastructure expansion and investment expenditure growth was close to 17% for FY25, but what was achieved in the first 6 months was only 15.4%. And in fact, this trend continued even for the 7 months, it remained at about 14.7%. So more than half of the year was lost because of this contraction in the central government capital expenditure. State governments also did not do much. One can say that probably because of the presence of the general elections, this might have been the case. Apart from the investment contraction, in fact, investment expansion contraction, the private final consumption expenditure grew at 6%, which I would say was still healthy, although a little lower than expected. But the main reason why the output side also showed a slowdown was because of the secondary sector, particularly mining and quarrying, manufacturing, construction, and electricity, water supply, etc. If we consider together, the secondary sector grew only at 3.7%. Within that, manufacturing, which has a relatively higher weight, grew only by 2.2%. So while agriculture did okay in terms of its long-term performance at 3.5%, the tertiary sector also did very well in the sense that it was about 7.1%. This is the immediate reason, that is the contraction in GOI investment expenditure growth. Alongside, we can also look at what was happening recently is that the global economic conditions have contained significant tailwinds because of the ongoing supply side constraints, which are linked to the ongoing wars both in the Middle East and the Israel linked issues also. And this is a situation which has been there for about 2 to 3 years. And I do not think that this might settle down in the near future. And therefore, global headwinds will continue, and we will therefore have to depend very largely on domestic drivers of growth. Now, within domestic drivers, the consumption expenditure expansion growth is relatively has a larger weight, but does not vary much. So it remains within the range of, let us say, 5.5 to 6.5%. What is the real engine of growth is investment expenditure growth, and within that, government's own growth, government's own capital expenditure growth. Now, here the issue is that while government has been driving it, that engine also stopped or stalled in the first 6 months of the year, especially in the second quarter, that the impact became very visible. Now we have to make sure that both sides of investment, that is private expenditure, also investment expenditure, also picks up, and government continues to retain the momentum that is it has been maintaining for a longer period. Therefore, the common man would suffer if we have a growth which is much less than potential growth. Potential growth means that we are reaching a level of employment of available factors of production without causing much inflation. And therefore, if the growth rate is allowed to fall below 6%, that will actually affect the common man quite significantly. In fact, in this quarter, what became very visible was that urban incomes and urban employment saw a very significant slowdown. And as a result of that, the expenditure growth on the urban side was also tepid. We hope that in the medium term, government will get back to its investment expenditure momentum, and there we might be able to maintain a cruise speed of about 6.5% of growth in the medium term. And if that is done, we might be able to focus on two other major issues, that is employment and containing inflation.
So, thank you for that, Dr. Srivastava. What does this translate into? Can one come to a conclusion that given that Indian economy grew 8.2 last year, and now we are sort of penciling in a 6.5 to 7% growth. So, can one come to any conclusion as to how the common man is he worse off than last fiscal?
Well, this year, I think everybody has revised the growth forecast, annual growth forecast, that is, to lower than 7%, which was the RBI forecast earlier. And our own forecast is about 6.5%. And what it means for the common man is that we will have to settle at a growth rate which is less than 7%. It might be signaling that maintaining a 7% growth in the medium term, year after year, may be difficult if that growth is going to depend entirely on domestic growth drivers. And we have to wait for global conditions to improve before we can aim at a 7% growth again. And unless we reach somewhere in the range of 6.5 to 7%, we may not be able to create conditions for significant improvement in the employment situation. That would affect the common man.
So it could in turn translate into lower disposable incomes.
Definitely, yes.
And therefore could pinch the pockets or the wallets of the common man.
Yes. That is likely to be the case.
So, Dr. Srivastava, what could be the useful intervention that government can think on a macro side? When I say government and RBI, given the inflation situation, and do you see a case for RBI to bite the interest bullet in the February MPC meeting to give that much needed push to the growth momentum?
Right. So, in fact, the level of CPI inflation and the structure of CPI inflation are both material for the welfare of the common man. And this, of course, happens to be one of the major considerations, macro considerations for policymakers. Now, RBI's mandate is to focus on overall CPI inflation. And overall CPI inflation has been and has remained in recent months also well above 5%. In fact, in October, it was 6.2%. In November, it came down to 5.5%. And as long as it remains high, that is well above the mean target of 4%, RBI will find it difficult to reduce the repo rate or the policy rate. And what we should recognize is that this overall CPI inflation consists of core inflation of 3.7%, which is below 4%. The rest of that inflation is coming from mostly because of either energy prices or food prices. Now, energy prices is largely exogenous, and although in recent months, global crude prices have remained below $75 per barrel. Therefore, I would say that the real concern, both for the policymaker and in the context of the common man, is the food inflation. That food inflation is a supply side inflation, mostly because of seasonal shortfalls in supply of goods such as vegetables, particularly vegetables, and other protein based items such as eggs, meat, fish, etc., as also manufactured food products. The food inflation has remained relatively high, and the government has to really intervene on the supply side of this equation. And since this is happening repeatedly quarter after quarter, it has to find a solution either in terms of identifying the areas of shortages and then making up a plan or a strategy to intervene in it at the right time. And if that is done, then inflation can be brought down. My own view is that if a suitable strategy can be devised to contain food inflation in the range of, let us say, 4 to 6%, then the overall CPI inflation can be targeted at 4% successfully. If that happens, then it is going to become possible to reduce the repo rate from the present level of 6.5%. That is very desirable in terms of macro policy formulation, because most of the burden in the last 2 to 3 years post-COVID years has been borne by the fiscal policy intervention. It is because of that fiscal deficit has remained very high, much higher than the FRBM norms, and debt and interest payment burden has also remained high. These are not conditions conducive for maintaining a medium-term growth of 7% or so. And therefore, a good strategy would be to bring food inflation down by supply-side interventions, and then let both monetary and fiscal policy operate on an equal basis so that inflation and growth can both be attended to. My own sense is that in February, possibly, the likelihood is very strong that there would be at least a 25 basis points of reduction in the policy rate. And the reason for that is that Ministry of Finance has been signaling that for some time, that actually the monetary authorities should also begin to share some of the burden for driving growth.
Absolutely. So now, given the slowdown, the need to push growth up has become even more immediate and current requirement, right?
Yes, yes.
So, Dr. Srivastava, would that translate to a better second half for the common man, given the well documented narrative in the Indian situation that monetary easing takes time to percolate down the system?
Yes, I think any benefits to the common man and the private sector investment would take some time, even if the rate reduction happens in February. The transmission of that through the system will take time, and we will be easily passing over the fiscal year before any positive effect becomes visible. One more aspect of this is that actually the nominal GDP growth has also come down rather sharply. In the first 2 quarters, that has averaged about 8.5% or so. Budgeted nominal GDP growth is 10.5%.
Correct.
Short of that assumption, then the tax revenue performance might also be compromised. The budget targets may not be met, in which case There may be an issue in terms of what the government may do for various welfare schemes and so on. It might have to then adjust some of the welfare schemes.
So, what would you, just to extend this thought, what would you feel as the ideal way? Should government look to accelerate fiscal consolidation given the growth slowdown, or should government allow the fiscal consolidation roadmap to wait for one more year before we eye 4.5%?
I think the fiscal consolidation target of 4.5% should still be met, but government should not aim at accelerating it beyond that very quickly. It should pursue that fiscal consolidation path in the medium term and take another 2 years or 3 years to come closer to the FRBM target of 3.3% or 3.5% before relaxing on capital expenditure growth. The priority should still be maintaining GOI's investment expenditure growth. That will help us in two ways. First, infrastructure expansion, which is very deficient in India as compared to global peers, would reduce the unit costs of producing, both for the public sector and the private sector, and make us more competitive. So it will have a cost side benefit. But while we are doing that, it also has a demand side benefit in the sense that this becomes a domestic demand driver, and it is the only driver or the only engine which is available to policymakers in the kind of global situation that presently prevails. So we cannot rely on export demand, and we have to rely on domestic demand. Within that also, private consumption demand is relatively stable, and therefore the drive has to be investment expenditure. So that is where we have to focus on fiscal consolidation. We should do incrementally and succeed in the medium term.
Got it. So, Dr. Srivastava, thank you for the macro picture. Now, let's talk a bit about the micro interventions that can improve the lot of the common man. So, one aspect of expenditure which is widely talked about is this government program on Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana, right?
Yes. Yes.
And how do you think has it improved the lot of the common man? Has it made any dent on poverty this year?
Well, this I think has been a major intervention of the government. The government has extended this particular scheme for another 5 years. So it will go until 2029. The beneficiaries that are covered under this scheme is actually the number of beneficiaries is quite large, in the sense that it is estimated that it is more than 80 crore beneficiaries. And when it is extended for the next 5 years, then overall allocation of resources would touch close to 12 lakh crore. That's a major welfare improving scheme. Now, the benefit of this is that this is in some sense a supply side intervention, in the sense that it makes the food grains available to a very large number of households in India at the lower income end. Apart from the fact that it therefore provides that, it generates an income effect in these households. And that happens because whatever those households would have spent on the procurement of these food grains can then be spent on other household needs, particularly on education and health. So when we consider multidimensional poverty, where it is not only access to food and nutrition, but also access to various other services like health and education, which are also subsidized, by the way. And in the case of health, there are other important schemes also. So together, these schemes actually have helped India reduce what is known as extreme poverty. And in fact, in a global poverty calendar, it is estimated that India has now overcome extreme poverty. And government's own estimates also indicate that in terms of multidimensional poverty, there has been a very significant improvement because of these kinds of schemes. So although these do not directly added to income, but they generate an income effect, which then gives access to various other services other than food grains. And therefore, these have been a very positive, this has been a very positive intervention as far as I can assess.
So, can I count this as the most significant intervention for the benefit of the common man, given that petrol prices have not been adjusted by the government, right?
Well, I would say that if we have to consider the most important intervention, there can be two other contenders in terms of policy intervention. One is the Ayushman Bharat Yojana and the other is the Jan Dhan Yojana. In the Ayushman Yojana, there are 55 crore beneficiaries. This year, another 6 crore beneficiaries have been added through the extension of this scheme to the senior citizens. The Jan Dhan Yojana also covers about 52 crore beneficiaries who take benefit of financial inclusion. But considering all facts together, I think the impact of Garib Kalyan Anna Yojana is far more than these policy interventions. Of course, all these benefits are supplementary to each other. But I would still rate Garib Kalyan Anna Yojana as the most important intervention.
And more, Dr. Srivastava, is because this extension happened before in 2024 for another 5 years, right? Whereas the other two schemes have been running for some years now.
Yes. So, although it happened in an election year, but the fact that it has been extended for 5 years speaks for the benefits that were reaped earlier and the potential benefits that are expected as we go along.
So that comes to a big question that I have, a sort of a overall assessment from your end as to how 2024 has been for the common man, given that he is also buffeted by inflation and other aspects. How do you assess? Has it been a very terrible year for a common man in 2024, or is it been better off because of these government interventions?
Well, I would assess that the common man has not been in a terrible condition, but fairly tepid economic condition, in the sense that the common man really looks for an economy that would be able to offer him productive employment opportunity so that he can earn for himself and his family. Now, the employment situation, in spite of this growth, although that has been compromised a little, and in spite of the ability of the government at least to meet certain minimum needs, the main objective of the main welfare improving dimension of the common man is the opportunity to participate in productive employment in the economy.
Absolutely.
On that front, I think the policies of the government do not add up to a satisfactory situation. There was a set of budget proposals for augmentation of employment.
Correct. The Prime Minister's 5 interventions, which were together called PMELI.
Yes. Now, those schemes have actually not taken off. It is very surprising that the heart of the budget, in terms of infrastructure expansion and in terms of the employment promoting schemes, both languished, even though we are passing the calendar year now and only 3 months are left. I think the government says that all this is because of budget, but the presence of elections did not actually cannot actually explain this away, in the sense that when earlier general elections happened, primary expenditure of government actually increased by 1 percentage points. It is an exceptional case that actually primary expenditure, in fact, could not maintain its proportion relative to GDP in this year. Now, the whole purpose of presenting an interim budget is actually to enable the government departments to continue the momentum of expenditure, particularly when we know that it is the domestic demand that is driving the growth in the economy. Therefore, it comes as a surprise.
So basically, your message is maybe we have, or the government has faltered in the pace of execution of the ELI schemes, which was seen to be a very important facet of the July budget.
Yeah, well, I do not think so. I think this is some kind of inertia that has set in the sense that the thinking has been that because we are extending some of these benefits which are tangible to the relatively poorer households, that would be sufficient or adequate. But actually, welfare improvement of the citizens by and large can only come when they participate in the productive activities of the economy. It cannot come by subsidization and by supplementary support. Those supports help keep the extreme poverty level down, but it does not help in creating productive employment. And therefore, policymakers need to actually consider the nature of their intervention in much greater depth.
So, what should be priority for the government with budget round the corner? Should we look at more new interventions or upping the game on existing ELI-led announcements?
Think that
Ensuring
these
that
ELI schemes are,
2025 is a better year for the common man.
yeah, I think these ELI schemes were not, can only have a supplementary role, can only have some kind of incremental role. These are kind of symbolic. They do not attend to the structural nature of the unemployment problem.
But it is very ambitious, no, Dr. Srivastava, 2 lakh crores outlay over the next 5 years, bringing 4 crore youth into the employment universe.
It is ambitious, but this may not be the way in which issue of employment should be considered. I think what we need is to consider the structural nature of unemployment. As the demographic dividend in India unfolds, we have more and more people who are joining the labor force. They are in the working age group. Their skill levels are not up to the mark in terms of their capacity to get absorbed in the formal sector of the economy. They eke out existence either in agriculture with a full or disguised employment opportunity there, or they join the informal sectors of the economy. Now, the mismatch happens, the structural mismatch happens because of the mismatch between the level of skills and technological knowledge of technology which is required. And to redress that, we need to really change our skill education system in general and skill building system in particular. And the same money, I think, would be better spent if we could remove these structural bottlenecks as a matter of strategy. I would suggest that we should think of universal employment scheme. Sometimes we have a discussion on universal basic income as a policy strategy. But I think what we need is an universal employment scheme so that minimum employment is guaranteed both in rural and urban areas. And then strengthen the education and technology and skill building system in a massive way so that we can meet the unfolding twin challenges of on one side labor saving technology and on the other side more and more labor joining the workforce.
Sure. So thank you for that detailed perspective, Dr. Srivastava. So one closing comment on there is so much of debate in the Indian system on the need to calibrate petrol and diesel pricing in sync with international prices, which has not happened in the Indian situation, right? So, do you
Yes.
think common man will be better off if government gets more focused on the pricing around petrol and diesel so that some relief gets passed to Indian households?
Well, global crude prices have remained on average below 75 USD per barrel. I would consider that as a favorable situation for India. And the Indian crude basket.
Sorry, I am with you there, but go ahead. You were talking about the Indian crude basket.
Yeah, so Indian crude basket has actually improved from April of 2024 to December, where the average price fell from 89, close to 89, to about 73. All that benefit has not been passed on to the consumers. What was passed on, I think, by the oil marketing companies was about 2 rupees per liter on petrol. There has not been any additional concession through central excise. Some of the state governments have actually reduced some part of their VAT on petroleum products. But on the whole, the petroleum situation is such that the room for maneuver is limited. And within this overall retail price, the central government tax, the state government tax, the oil marketing company margin have all to be accommodated. Now, I think that when the supply side begins to improve through all these interventions on non-conventional energy and by exploitation of some of the new finds within India about sources of petroleum, if all those supply side interventions begin to show benefits, then India might be in a situation to actually bring retail petroleum prices significantly down. But until that happens, we might have to live at levels of retail prices at about the present level.
So, to that extent, a common man cannot expect relief coming his way
Through this route.
for 2025.
Yes.
Got it. So, thanks a lot, Dr. Srivastava, for all your perspective, for sharing with us both the macro and the micro related policy interventions that can be brought about to the Indian economy in the current state of play. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.